Alpha King paid for practical wife, but found woman who made him smile through chaos. The winter winds howled through the jagged mountains surrounding the kingdom of Arindor. Snow fell in heavy sheets covering the dark stone walls of the castle like a blanket of silence. Within those walls lived the Alpha King Dorian, a man whose name alone could make nobles tremble and commoners whisper in fear. He was a ruler of unyielding power, with eyes like storm clouds and a heart that had learned to hide its warmth behind layers of control. Dorian had long resigned himself to solitude. His past was filled with loss and betrayal, and he had built walls around his soul as high as the castle ramparts. For years he had sought a practical wife, someone who could fulfill the duties of marriage without complicating the life he had forged from ice and iron. The thought of love or laughter seemed distant, even impossible. Lyra was far from the life she had dreamed of. Born to a poor family on the edge of the kingdom, she had learned early that survival often demanded sacrifice. When her parents, desperate and frightened, agreed to sell her as a practical wife to the Alpha King, Lyra had felt a mix of fear and resignation. She had promised herself that no matter what happened, she would not allow herself to be broken. She was clever, resourceful, and determined to survive, even in the shadow of the king's immense power. The first time Lyra set foot in the castle, the weight of the place pressed upon her like a physical force. The halls were vast and cold, lined with tapestries that depicted battles long past. Torches flickered along the walls, casting moving shadows that seemed almost alive. Servants moved silently, bowing their heads and avoiding direct eye contact. Dorian watched from the balcony above, his tall figure cutting a commanding silhouette against the gray sky. He had heard of Lyra's arrival and was curious, not for her personality, but for the fact that she was to be his wife, purchased as one purchases a piece of property or a rare gem. Duty had made the decision for him, not desire. When Lyra was brought before him, she held her head high, refusing to let fear show in her eyes. The Alpha King studied her silently, noting her posture, her expression, and the quiet confidence that seemed unusual for someone in her position. She was no ordinary girl, he realized, but whether that was a threat or a gift, he could not yet tell.
"Welcome to Arindor," Dorian said finally, his voice deep and steady, carrying authority in every word.
"I trust you understand your role here." Lyra bowed slightly, keeping her tone respectful.
"I do, Your Majesty." There was a pause, then she added softly, "I will do what is expected of me."
Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the faintest flicker of intrigue at the thought that this young woman might challenge him in ways no one else had dared. He said nothing further, turning away to leave her in the cold, shadowed hallway. Lyra quickly learned the rhythm of Dorian's world, the cold meals in the grand dining hall, the endless reports and council meetings, and the sharp eyes of courtiers who watched every move for weakness. Yet, she also discovered moments that were hers alone. The quiet corners of the library, where ancient tomes spoke of magic and kings long past, or the sunlit terrace, where she could catch a glimpse of the mountains beyond the walls. At first, he saw only the obedience and caution expected of her role, but slowly, he noticed the subtle ways she adapted, the intelligence in her questions, and the unexpected courage that surfaced in small acts of defiance, like correcting a servant who had been unjust or speaking firmly to a noble who tried to intimidate her. Each act, small as it was, drew his attention. Their first true conversation happened by chance in the castle gardens, which were almost barren under the weight of winter. Dorian had come to walk alone, as he often did, and found Lyra standing beneath a twisted old tree, her breath visible in the frosty air. "You should not be here," he said, his voice low. "The gardens are dangerous this time of year." "I am careful. Besides, I prefer to learn about the world myself, rather than being told what is safe." Dorian's lips twitched almost imperceptibly. No one had spoken to him with such honesty, without fear or flattery. "Most would call that foolishness," he replied. "Perhaps," she said, "but sometimes foolishness is the only way to survive, in a place where others try to control everything." There was silence for a moment. The wind blew through the branches above them, scattering the snow around their feet. For the first time, Dorian saw not just a practical wife, but a woman who carried her own strength quietly, without demand for recognition. Before he could respond, a dark shadow moved among the trees, almost imperceptible. Lyra stiffened, her eyes widening as something cold and unnatural lunged at her. Dorian reacted without thought, his body moving with the speed and precision of a predator. He intercepted the shadow, pushing Lyra out of harm's way, and the creature recoiled, vanishing into the depths of the gardens. Lyra's heart raced, but instead of fear, there was awe. She looked at Dorian, and for the first time she saw the raw intensity behind his composed exterior. He was a man capable of both danger and protection, a king who bore his power like a blade in the dark. "Are you hurt?" Dorian asked, his voice softer now, though still commanding. "No," Lyra said, steadying herself. "But what was that?" Dorian shook his head, frowning.
"That is not something to concern yourself with, for now."
But his eyes lingered on her as if measuring how much courage she truly had. That night, as Lyra settled into her chambers, she thought about the man she was meant to serve. He was fearsome, yes, but also human. She wondered if beneath his icy exterior there was room for trust, or even friendship. And maybe, though she barely admitted it to herself, she longed for something more than the life of silence and obedience she had imagined. For Dorian, sleep came fitfully. The image of Lyra in the gardens haunted him, the way her eyes had met his, unflinching, and the faintest smile that seemed to mock the very rules he had built around his life. She was supposed to be practical, quiet, and forgettable. Instead, she stirred something long buried, curiosity, and perhaps something even more dangerous, a flicker of hope. Days passed, each filled with the rhythm of castle life and the subtle tension that grew between them. Lyra learned to navigate the complex etiquette of the court, while Dorian observed her quietly, noting how she treated the servants with fairness, how she spoke with intelligence, and how she managed to make even the most hostile nobles pause and reconsider. One afternoon, Dorian summoned her to the council chambers, a room where decisions of war and governance were made. The nobles present shifted uncomfortably as Lyra entered, unsure why the king would bring his new wife into such serious matters. "You will observe," Dorian said, his gaze sharp, "and you will speak if I ask you. Otherwise, remain silent."
Lyra nodded, taking a seat with her back straight.
As the discussion progressed, she listened carefully, noticing details that even seasoned advisors overlooked. When Dorian finally asked her opinion, she spoke clearly, suggesting a strategic solution that was both practical and daring. The room fell silent, and Dorian's eyes met hers, a spark of approval hidden beneath his stern expression. That evening, Dorian walked alone through the corridors, his mind restless. Lyra's words lingered, her insight striking him more than he cared to admit. He realized that the woman he had purchased to fulfill a duty was far more than anyone could have imagined. And yet, the shadow that had appeared in the gardens still lingered in the back of his mind. The castle was not just a home. It was a place of secrets, magic, and danger. He knew deep down that Lyra's presence might draw him into chaos he had long avoided, but perhaps, he thought, some chaos was worth facing. As the moon rose over the snow-covered towers, Dorian's heart felt a strange stirring. He was the Alpha King, feared by all, yet the small, quiet woman he had brought into his life was the first to make him feel something he had not in years, the possibility of light in the darkness. Outside, the wind howled like a warning, carrying with it the whispers of unseen forces. Inside, a fire burned in the hearth, and two lives, once bound by duty alone, began a journey neither fully understood. And in that moment, beneath the cold shadow of the castle walls, Lyra and Dorian took the first step toward a bond that would challenge their fates, confront the darkness, and perhaps, one day, bring warmth where only ice had lived before. The days that followed Lyra's arrival in the castle passed like the silent drift of snow, cold, measured, and yet filled with unseen currents. The castle of Arendor was a place where every corridor had its secrets, every corner its watchers, and every shadow whispered warnings. But amid the icy halls and echoing chambers, a quiet warmth began to grow. Fragile, yet impossible to ignore. Lyra moved through her days with careful attention, learning the routines, the names, and the expectations of her new life. She studied the castle's maps, the faces of the courtiers, and the rules of etiquette that felt like armor over her true self. But there were moments she could not disguise, moments when her natural curiosity and courage shone through, small acts that drew the watchful eyes of the Alpha King without her even noticing. Dorian observed her constantly, from the balcony, from the shadows of the corridors, even in council chambers where his focus should have been on matters of war and diplomacy. He found his thoughts straying to her. There was something in the way she listened, in the subtle strength in her posture, that intrigued him. She was meant to be practical, obedient, and forgettable, yet she had begun to carve a space in his world that no one else had dared. The tension between them grew quietly, unspoken, but electric. Lyra noticed the way Dorian's gaze sometimes lingered, the faintest tilt of his lips when he thought no one watched. Dorian, in turn, felt his walls weaken, fragment by fragment, as her presence introduced something entirely new. Light, laughter, and, in the smallest gestures, trust. One cold evening, a messenger arrived from a neighboring kingdom with news that stirred both concern and unease. A rival noble house, long resentful of Dorian's rule, had begun to gather forces along the border. Their motives were not merely political. They sought to exploit any weakness in the Alpha King's domain, and rumors suggested they knew of Lyra's presence in the castle, seeing her not as a person but as a potential weapon to manipulate or provoke Dorian. Dorian read the report silently, his jaw tightening. He had expected threats, spies, and attacks, but the thought of someone using Lyra as a tool made something inside him darken. He looked toward the gardens where she sometimes walked, imagining her unaware of the danger, and the protective instinct he had tried to suppress stirred violently. Lyra, unaware of the full scope of the threat, approached the Alpha King that evening. She carried a small leather-bound book of maps and reports, her careful notes on the castle's defenses and surrounding terrain. She had begun to take her role seriously, not as a duty to be endured, but as a responsibility she could influence with her intelligence. "Your Majesty," she said softly, bowing her head. "I have studied the terrain near the northern passes. There are areas where intruders could pass unnoticed. If you allow me, I have suggestions that could strengthen our defenses." Dorian raised an eyebrow, studying her with the same intensity as he had in the gardens weeks before. He had not expected her to be proactive, let alone clever. Her presence was meant to be ornamental, not strategic. Yet here she was, offering insight that even his most trusted generals had overlooked. "Speak," he commanded. Lyra outlined her plans carefully, pointing to hidden passes, natural barriers, and vantage points where guards could see without being seen. She suggested small adjustments that could shift the balance in favor of the castle if enemies came. Dorian listened, his expression unreadable, though his mind raced. After she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he said, "You have a sharp mind, Lyra. I had not expected this." "I am not just a wife, Your Majesty," Lyra replied gently. "If you allow me to serve in ways beyond the household, I can help protect this place as much as any soldier." Dorian's eyes softened slightly, though only for a moment. "Perhaps," he said.
"But you must be careful. This castle has shadows that are not merely walls and doors."
"Some dangers cannot be seen until they are upon you." That night, Dorian found himself wandering the castle alone, restless. His thoughts were heavy with the day's revelations, but also with a strange, unfamiliar emotion. He realized that Lyra had begun to affect him in ways no one else had, challenging his assumptions, drawing out small smiles, and filling the spaces in his mind that had long been cold and empty. The next morning, Lyra ventured into the library, a room she had begun to consider a refuge. The library was vast, shelves stacked with ancient tomes, scrolls and texts on everything from alchemy to diplomacy. Here she could lose herself in knowledge, away from the prying eyes of courtiers, or the heavy expectations of the castle. Dorian appeared quietly, as he often did, slipping through the shadows. "You spend too much time alone," he said, his voice low and amused. "Even the most practical wife must eat, speak, and breathe beyond these walls." "I enjoy learning," she replied simply. "Knowledge is power, and understanding this castle may be the only way to survive it." "Survive?" Dorian repeated, his interest piqued. "You speak as if this place is a trap. Perhaps it is, for some. For others, it is a kingdom to command." "Ah!" Lyra met his gaze steadily. "A kingdom is only as strong as those who protect it. I do not seek power for myself, but I will not stand idle while threats go unnoticed." For a moment, the Alpha King studied her silently. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded, as if conceding some invisible point.
"Bit turned to leave, but paused. Very well," he said.
"You may continue your studies, but remember, knowledge is dangerous if it blinds you to what cannot be seen." Their interactions continued in this manner, each conversation a dance of observation, each shared moment a test of courage and insight. Lyra began to understand the subtle layers of Dorian's personality, his pride, his fear, his hidden longing for connection. Dorian, in turn, began to see her not as a transaction or a duty, but as a person whose strength and insight could complement his own. The spark between them grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the first light of dawn in a darkened world. It was not romantic in the ordinary sense. It was a recognition, a mutual understanding that each could face challenges stronger together than alone. Yet even in these small moments, tension lingered, as both struggled with the unspoken rules of their positions. Then came the night that changed everything. The castle was quiet, blanketed in snow, the torches flickering in the corridors. Lyra had gone to the gardens for a brief walk, seeking the comfort of open air and the sound of wind against the trees. She did not notice the shadow that followed her, moving silently among the twisted branches. Dorian, sensing her presence at the edge of danger, had already been patrolling the perimeter. His instincts, sharpened over years of ruling and fighting, alerted him to a disturbance. He moved swiftly, a silent figure of strength and power. Before Lyra could realize it, the shadow lunged, a creature of darkness, a force that seemed more spirit than flesh. She froze, fear striking her chest, but Dorian was faster. With a single movement, he intercepted the attack, pushing Lyra out of harm's way. The shadow hissed and vanished, melting into the night as if it had never existed. Lyra's heart raced, but her fear quickly turned to awe. "Wait." "What was that?" she whispered. Dorian's eyes were sharp, intense, but there was something softer beneath the surface.
"It is not your concern," he said. "For now." He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder.
"But know this. This castle holds more than walls and guards. You are not entirely safe, even here." Lyra looked at him, seeing for the first time the weight of responsibility he carried, and the strange loneliness beneath his command. "I am not afraid," she said, though her voice trembled slightly.
I can face what comes if I am not alone.
For a long moment, Dorian said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, he allowed a small, fleeting smile to touch his lips. It was not a smile of amusement or flirtation. It was something rarer, a glimpse of humanity and connection, the faintest sign that the Alpha King, feared by all, could feel warmth toward another being. That night, as Lyra returned to her chambers, she thought about the man she had begun to see differently. He was fearsome, yes, but also capable of protecting, guiding, and, she realized, with a flutter in her chest, perhaps even caring. She wondered if this strange bond, forged in shadow and challenge, could grow into something neither of them had expected. For Dorian, the night was restless. He could not stop thinking about her, the way she had faced danger, the cleverness she had shown, the courage that refused to be hidden. She was no ordinary wife, no mere transaction. She had begun to make him feel emotions long buried: curiosity, admiration, and perhaps something more dangerous still, something akin to hope. But outside the castle walls, in the dark forests and mountains, unseen eyes watched. Whispers of intrigue and malice drifted on the wind. The rival noble house, learning of Lyra's presence, was already plotting. And the shadow that had attacked her in the garden was only the beginning of dangers that neither Dorian nor Lyra could yet foresee. The quiet spark between them had been lit, fragile but undeniable. And as the castle slept beneath the winter moon, both the Alpha King and his practical wife, who was becoming far more than a title, prepared unknowingly for the chaos that was to come. The castle of Arendor trembled under the first signs of real danger. Snowstorms had turned to rain, and the cold air carried the scent of smoke from distant fires. Reports of movement along the northern passes had grown more frequent, and whispers of conspiracy reached even the quietest corners of the halls. Dorian the Alpha King stood atop the castle battlements, watching the dark horizon, his eyes sharp and unyielding. He had never feared enemies before. He had faced armies, assassins, and treacherous nobles. But this time was different. This time, his concern was not for himself. It was for her, Lyra, his practical wife, who had become far more than a duty in his life. Lyra had been unusually quiet that morning, studying the maps he had asked her to review. Her eyes, bright with focus, traced the paths of the mountains, noting where ambushes could be laid, where rivers might be crossed, and where the enemy could strike without warning. "You notice things others do not," Dorian said, appearing in the doorway without a sound. His tall frame, cloaked in the shadows of the room, made him seem like a part of the stone walls themselves. Lyra looked up, startled but not afraid. "I pay attention," she said simply. "It is easier to protect something when you understand it completely. And yet," Dorian said, his voice softer than usual, "you are still here, alive, and the castle is safe."
"Your bravery is, remarkable."
Lyra felt her cheeks warm at the praise, though she tried to hide it. "I am only doing what is necessary," she replied. "I do not wish to be brave. I only wish to survive, and perhaps to help those who cannot defend themselves." For a moment, silence stretched between them. The quiet was not empty. It was heavy with meaning, with recognition. Dorian saw in her eyes a depth of courage and intelligence he had not anticipated. She was no ordinary wife. She was a partner, a confidant, a light in the darkness he had long embraced. Their fragile connection was interrupted by a sudden cry from the castle gates. Dorian's instincts snapped into action. Without a word, he grabbed his cloak and motioned for Lyra to follow. "Stay close," he commanded. "Do not speak unless I ask you to." Outside, chaos had erupted. A small force from the rival noble house had breached the outer defenses, seeking to strike fear into the heart of Arendor. Guards clashed with the intruders, swords flashing, the sound of steel ringing through the air. Dorian moved like a shadow, his presence alone commanding both fear and respect. Lyra followed, moving quickly and carefully, keeping behind him as he struck with precise, controlled power. The battle was brief but intense. The intruders were driven back, though not without cost. Some guards had been wounded, and a section of the outer wall had been damaged. Dorian's expression remained hard, but his eyes searched constantly for Lyra. When he finally saw her, unharmed but wide-eyed, a rare flicker of relief softened his stern features. "You handled yourself well," he said, as they returned to the safety of the inner courtyard. "Better than I expected." Lyra swallowed, her heart still racing. I
I only did what I thought was right, she admitted.
I followed you. Dorian studied her for a long moment. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of fear, determination, and something unspoken that made him realize just how much he had come to depend on her presence.
You are more than I imagined, he said quietly, almost to himself. The days that followed were tense.
The enemy's movements were not yet fully understood, and the castle remained on high alert. Lyra continued her studies of the maps, the terrain, and the castle's defenses. Dorian, though preoccupied with the threat, found himself watching her constantly, noting the way she moved, the way her mind worked, the way she inspired confidence in the guards and servants alike. One evening, after a long day of preparation, Dorian found Lyra alone in the gardens once more. Snow had begun to fall lightly, dusting the trees and pathways in a soft silver blanket. She looked up as he approached, her expression calm but alert. "You seem restless," she observed, noting the tension in his shoulders and the intensity in his eyes. "I am," he admitted. "This threat is unlike any we have faced, and I cannot ignore the possibility that it will reach beyond the walls, beyond even the guards. It could reach you." Lyra's gaze softened, but she did not flinch. "I am not afraid," she said. "Not if you are here."
"And not if we face it together." Dorian's eyes met hers, and for the first time he felt the weight of his emotions pressing against the walls he had built around himself. "Together," he repeated, almost as if testing the word on his tongue. "Perhaps,
yes, together." It was in that moment, beneath the falling snow, that Dorian allowed himself to admit what he had long denied. He cared for her, more than duty required. He had never expected to feel warmth in the cold halls of his castle, yet here it was, growing steadily, quietly, in the presence of the woman he had purchased as a practical wife. But danger was never far away. One night, while the castle slept, Lyra awoke to a faint, chilling whisper at her window. The shadows seemed to twist unnaturally, and the air grew cold as if something unseen had entered the room. She drew the curtains back and gasped, not at what she saw, but at what she felt. A presence, dark and deliberate, lingered outside. Dorian, sensing the disturbance from his chambers, moved swiftly. He arrived just in time to see the shadow retreat into the night, leaving only a lingering chill. He placed a firm hand on Lyra's shoulder. "You are safe," he said, though his own heart raced. "But know this, the castle is not the only danger. Forces are moving that neither of us fully understand." Lyra nodded, shivering slightly.
"Then we must be ready, together."
As the days went by, Dorian and Lyra worked tirelessly. They strengthened the castle's defenses, trained the guards, and studied the enemy's movements. In the quiet moments between duties, they began to speak more freely, sharing fragments of their pasts. Lyra spoke of her family, her struggles, and the sacrifices she had made. Dorian revealed pieces of his own loneliness, the burdens of his crown, and the losses that had shaped him into the man he had become. Their connection deepened, built not on passion alone, but on mutual respect, trust, and the quiet understanding that they could face challenges together. In each other, they found strength, courage, and even moments of unexpected laughter, a rare light in the shadowed halls of the castle. One afternoon, a scout arrived with troubling news. The rival noble house had forged an alliance with a group of mercenaries and planned a large-scale attack on the castle. The timing was unknown, but their intent was clear. They sought to destabilize Dorian's rule and capture or harm Lyra, knowing her influence over the king. Dorian's face darkened. "We will meet them with every force we have," he said, his voice low and steady. "No harm will come to this castle, and no harm will come to her." Lyra, sensing the gravity of the situation, stepped forward.
"Then let us plan carefully. We can anticipate their moves and prepare traps."
"The castle is stronger than they think, and we know it better than they ever will." For hours they worked side by side, drawing strategies, assigning duties, and reviewing every detail. Each glance, each shared insight, built a silent bond between them. A bond that no enemy could sever with swords or fire. That night, after the planning was complete, they walked together along the snow-covered terrace. The moonlight reflected off the frozen garden fountains, casting silver shadows across the ground. "You have changed this castle," Dorian said quietly, almost to himself. "Not with walls or weapons, but with your presence. You make people, me, see things differently." Lyra looked at him, her eyes soft. "I only hope I have helped," she said. "I never expected to find anything beyond duty. Yet here, I feel something I cannot ignore." Dorian stopped, turning to face her fully. "I feel it too," he admitted. "You were meant to be practical, and yet you have brought warmth to a place that has known only cold for years." For a moment, the snow fell silently around them, and the world seemed to hold its breath. They stood close, aware of the connection growing between them, the bond forged through danger, trust, and shared understanding. And then, without warning, a distant horn echoed through the valley. The enemy had moved. The attack was imminent. Dorian's face hardened, his protective instincts flaring. "Stay inside," he commanded. "Do not leave the castle walls." Lyra nodded, but a part of her wanted to fight beside him, to face the chaos with the man who had become more than a king to her. She realized that their bond had grown too strong, their trust too deep, to remain apart while danger approached. The castle prepared for battle. Torches lit the walls, and guards took their positions. Dorian moved like a shadow among them, his eyes constantly searching for Lyra. He would not allow harm to touch her. Not now, not ever. And in that quiet, tense night, both the Alpha King and his practical wife understood that their lives, their hearts, and their kingdom were about to be tested like never before. The night air was sharp and bitter, carrying the scent of smoke and the distant echoes of approaching danger. The castle of Arendor, once silent and grand, now thrummed with tension. Guards hurried through the corridors, torches flaring against the dark stone walls. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a warning. Dorian, the Alpha King, moved like a shadow himself, silent, controlled, and unyielding. He had faced countless threats in his life, but tonight was different. Tonight, the danger was not only for the kingdom, it was for her. Lyra, the woman he had purchased as a practical wife, had become far more than a duty. She had become the center of his life, the spark in a heart long frozen, the light that made him question his solitude. Lyra stood in the inner courtyard, her breath visible in the cold night air. She was not idle. Guided by her intelligence and courage, she helped direct the guards, organize defenses, and offered insight that even Dorian himself had not anticipated. She moved with a calm determination, her mind sharp even as the threat grew closer. "You are certain about this route?" Dorian asked, his deep voice cutting through the wind. He pointed to a narrow path leading into the forest, a place where enemy forces might attempt a stealth attack. "I am," Lyra replied, her tone steady. "They will not expect us to use the mountain ridge as a trap. It is narrow, difficult, and perfect for ambushing anyone who comes this way." Dorian nodded, impressed despite himself. "You think like a commander," he said softly. "I had not imagined that you would." His words trailed unfinished, because he realized what he felt. Pride, trust, and an emotion far deeper than he had allowed himself to name. Together they moved through the castle, checking defenses, instructing the guards, and preparing for the inevitable clash. The enemy was skilled, but they underestimated the strength, intelligence, and courage that now resided within the walls of Arendor. Hours passed, and the first signs of the attack appeared. Torches flickered in the distance, shadows moved across the snow, and the faint sound of horns signaled the enemy's approach. Dorian and Lyra took their positions near the northern battlement side by side, their presence alone inspiring the soldiers. "You will stay behind me," Dorian said, his voice low but commanding. Lyra shook her head slightly, her eyes fierce. "No. We face this together. If you are in danger, I will be beside you." "I will not hide." For a long moment, Dorian studied her, seeing the fire in her eyes, the bravery that matched his own. Finally, he nodded. "Together, then," he said, and in that simple word they sealed an unspoken bond, one built not from duty, but from trust, respect, and shared courage. The battle erupted with sudden intensity. Enemy forces attempted to breach the castle walls, but Dorian's strategic mind paired with Lyra's insight allowed them to anticipate every move. Arrows flew, swords clashed, and the sound of combat echoed through the mountains. Lyra moved swiftly, helping direct soldiers, closing gates, and tending to the wounded. Her courage inspired the defenders, giving them hope when the night seemed darkest. Dorian fought with unmatched skill and ferocity, his every action precise and deadly. Yet even amidst the chaos, his mind was never far from Lyra, constantly checking, protecting, and guiding her through the danger. At one point, a group of enemy mercenaries attempted to flank the battlements. Lyra noticed them first, pointing them out to Dorian just in time. With swift, coordinated action, they drove the attackers back, saving many lives. When the battle finally paused, the courtyard was battered, and the walls bore scars from the attack. Yet the castle, Dorian and Lyra, side by side, surveyed the aftermath, their eyes meeting in the moonlight. "You did not need to fight alongside me," Dorian said quietly, almost as if he were admitting a truth he had kept hidden. "You could have stayed safe, yet you risked everything."
"I would not leave you to face it alone, nor the people who rely on this castle."
Courage is not about fearlessness. It is about acting despite fear. Dorian felt something stir deep within him, a mixture of admiration, gratitude, and something far more personal. He had spent years ruling through fear and power alone, yet here was a woman who showed him that trust and shared strength could create something stronger than fear. Connection.
Days passed and the enemy's forces retreated, leaving the castle battered but victorious.
The kingdom remained intact, thanks in no small part to Lyra's bravery and intelligence. The court spoke of her courage in whispers and awe, and even the most skeptical nobles could not deny her value. Dorian found her alone in the library one evening, the first quiet moment since the chaos began. She was reviewing maps and notes, her mind already thinking ahead, planning for the safety of the kingdom. "You never cease to impress," Dorian said, stepping closer. His tall shadow fell across the table, but his tone was soft, almost vulnerable. Lyra looked up, surprised by the warmth in his voice. "I only do what I must," she said, though a small smile played at her lips. "No," Dorian said firmly. "You do more than what is required. You inspire. You make people, me, believe in more than duty alone." Lyra's heart beat faster at his words. She had not expected him to speak so openly, to reveal even a fragment of the feelings he had hidden for so long.
"I am glad if I have helped," she said softly, unsure how to express the emotions building within her. Dorian stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "Lyra," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "you were brought here as a practical wife, but you have become everything I never knew I needed." Lyra's breath caught. "Dorian," she began, her voice trembling slightly, but he silenced her with a gentle, firm gesture.
"You do not need to speak," he said. "I know what we feel, even if words cannot fully capture it."
"I care for you more than I ever thought possible, and I will protect you, always." A quiet warmth spread through Lyra's chest. For the first time since arriving at the castle, she allowed herself to feel hope, not just for survival, but for a life that could include happiness, trust, and even love. She reached out, taking his hand in hers, and for a long moment, they simply stood together, the chaos of the outside world fading. But the night was not yet over. From the distant mountains, a shadow moved, watching the castle with intent. The dark forces that had threatened Arindor were patient and cunning. Even as Dorian and Lyra held each other, the world outside reminded them that peace was never permanent. The next day, they worked together to rebuild the castle, strengthen defenses, and restore order. Soldiers and servants alike looked to Lyra and Dorian for guidance, seeing in them a partnership that combined strength, intelligence, and unwavering courage. Slowly, the castle began to feel like more than a fortress. It began to feel like a home. In the quiet moments between duties, Dorian and Lyra allowed themselves small gestures of closeness, a hand brushing against the other, a shared smile, or a glance that lingered longer than necessary. Each moment reinforced their bond, a connection forged not by circumstance alone, but by choice, trust, and shared trials. One evening, as the sun rose over the snow-covered mountains, Dorian and Lyra stood together on the terrace watching the first light touch the castle towers. The world seemed peaceful for the first time in weeks, and yet both knew that vigilance was never far from necessity. "You have changed my life," Dorian said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "You have brought light to places I thought could only ever be dark, and for that, I am grateful." More than words can say, Lyra smiled, her own heart full. "And you have shown me that courage is not just surviving, but trusting and believing in something beyond fear. Together, we are stronger than either of us alone." For a long moment, they stood in silence, hands entwined, hearts aligned. They had faced danger, chaos, and uncertainty, yet they had emerged stronger, not only as allies but as partners in every sense. The kingdom of Arindor, though scarred by battle, had endured. The shadows that once threatened it had been held at bay, and within the castle walls a new bond had been forged, one that promised trust, courage, and a rare warmth that even the Alpha King had never known. And yet, as they looked toward the mountains, a distant shadow flickered, moving slowly, deliberately. The dangers of the world would never be fully gone. But for now, Dorian and Lyra had found something far more powerful than fear: each other.